What is up, everybody? Phil here, and welcome to KO Gaming. And for the past couple of days, I've been diving into the world of Nioh. For about 8 hours now, I've been experiencing the game that is super hyped and that everyone seems to be calling the second coming of Dark Souls due to many similarities to the From Software line of games, including very high difficulty and enemies that can seem to kill you within 1 to 2 hits, and a lot of kind of beginner's trap situations leading to cheap instant deaths. I definitely agree that there are a lot of similarities between Nioh and the Dark Souls franchise, but I also think that there are some key differences and possibly some major changes to the game since we all played it last year in its early alpha and some of those kind of last chance betas that were released over the course of 2016. In this video, what I would like to do is outline my experience with the game in the first 8 hours of gameplay, including the introductory stage where you're in a London prison, the kind of dojo tutorials, as well as the first 3 main stages and a few of the sub-stories slash side missions that have been available to me. Hopefully you'll get a little bit more of an idea about the game if you've been on the fence or haven't had a chance to play it yet on whether or not you want to pick it up, and I hope to clear up some of the confusion and some of the controversy that's all over the internet right now regarding this game, that basically it's not what it was promising to be. Let's talk a little bit about it. Before we even get started, I want to say up front, I'm playing the PlayStation 4 digital version of the game as downloaded off the United States PlayStation Network. The reason I'm saying that is because there seems to possibly be a discrepancy between versions of this game that were sold to the retail public. It may be actually a difference between the retail physical copies and the digital copies. For all intents and purposes, I'm playing the digital version, and that's the one I'm giving my impressions on in this video, but I'll talk a little bit later on in the video about the possible difference between the two, so let's get started. So first off, one of the major differences between all those preview versions of Nioh that we played in 2016 and the final version, and a major difference between this game and the Dark Souls franchise, it has tons of cutscenes, lots of story elaboration, and yeah, there's actually a story that's explained throughout the game. Not to say that Dark Souls doesn't have that, but a lot of the times in that franchise you end up reading the text descriptions of items and things that you find in the game and trying to piece together the story for yourself, while in Nioh, they make a much more wholehearted effort to kind of flesh out this interesting story with support characters and things going on. It is very well appreciated that in the modern era, these people realize if you're going to pay full retail price for a game, you should probably get a story that you don't have to read text to understand. So that's pretty good. When the game opens up, you end up in the Tower of London, a prison where your main character, William, basically has to break out and try to escape for himself. You'll learn the very basics of the game, and you get used to the visuals. Now, for me, I've opted to play the game in the lower resolution, but with full 60 frames per second, simply because this is something we've never really had in the Dark Souls franchise, and to be able to play an incredibly difficult game with a higher frame rate means you're going to be able to react better to things that may kill you instantly, and let me tell you, it is very much appreciated, even in these very early stage, to be able to dodge instantly when you press the button and dash through or past the attacks of these enemies that could kill you in 1 to 2 hits is very much appreciated, although it certainly is at the expense of the amount of detail in the game. It's not as detailed as, say, Dark Souls 3 was last year, but in my opinion, that's certainly okay. Being that I wanted to kind of refresh myself, I played through the basics of the game at the dojo, including different stances, high, mid, and low, which is one of the main critical differences between this game and Dark Souls, as a high stance is slower but deals more damage, mid stance is more of an all-around, and low stance is a much more evasive stance, but you don't really deal too much damage while you're in it. That's a pretty cool and unique game mechanic. There's also, right off the bat, kind of different projectiles, such as bows and or guns that can be used in the game. In particular, they're pretty damaging in Nioh, and they really turn out to be a pretty effective combat mechanic, which is actually why in a lot of cases the ammo for the game is so scarce. I think that if there was like unlimited ammo everywhere, it would basically be way overpowered, so it really makes you want to kind of judge, do I want to go melee, or do I want to use ranged combat on this tougher enemy and maybe try to take them out before I even get over there? It's pretty cool because a lot of the times in the Dark Souls franchise, you don't really have that option, because unless you've been specializing in the stats that are going to allow you to be good with a bow or a gun, those things are pretty ineffective, but in this case, they're pretty damned good throughout the game, and that's an awesome thing. So heading to mission 1, no surprise here, it's actually the same exact mission that you played if you did that early alpha last year in 2016. You're on a beachside village that is half kind of invaded by these marauders taking over everything and burning it down. Then when you get about halfway through, it converts over and you're now fighting these yokai demons, which is the name of the demonic enemies in the game who seem to be coming over from another dimension. They even have this like cool dark fog around their legs that doesn't allow you to regenerate your stamina too quickly unless you have a quick button press that's input at the correct time. In fact, that's one of the other unique game mechanics of Nioh, is that after you do a combination of melee attacks, there's a stamina bar that needs to be replenished. Now you can either just wait for it to be replenished, or if you do a timed button press of R1 on the PlayStation 4, you can actually regenerate it more early than you would have previously. In addition, those fields of yokai fog, or whatever they're called, will actually be negated if you press the button with the right timing, so it behooves you to learn to press the R1 button at the right time pretty early on in the game. It definitely helps, especially when you're in a situation where maybe there's 2 or 3 enemies coming after you and you're running out of stamina and you need to go on the run. You have to recover it as soon as possible, so you definitely have to try to recharge it using this mechanic. So, after going through this initial stage, I have to say that I felt that it was a hell of a lot easier than playing the alpha last year, but I pretty much chalked it up to the fact that I had already played it. I knew where all the enemies were, I knew where all the traps were, I knew where the bosses were, I kind of remembered almost everything that I had done in this game last year, and therefore I pretty much turboed through it, only dying a handful of times to a few cheap things and to the final boss of the stage, which I basically kind of got overconfident and tried to go all in instead of properly dodging like I should have. With all my experience in the From Software franchises, you think I would have learned by now, but of course not. I got too over bravado there, too much ego, and tried to kill him and got flattened. But after taking out the first stage, I said, okay, pretty much exactly what I would have expected. It's exactly like that alpha, no surprises here. Being that I had now played Nioh for several hours and really hadn't seen much of anything new besides that initial London Tower, I wanted to rush into the next stage rather than check out some of the side missions that had unlocked after completing the first one, so I jumped into main mission 2. Now this mission was totally new. I hadn't experienced this map at all before. It's a cliffside with a lot of caves intertwining in between. Once you get about halfway through this stage, you end up in this cool crystalline cavern full of the yokai monsters. Really enjoyable, although it seemed pretty short. I was able to beat it within about an hour to an hour and a half on the first run. In addition, yes, the enemies were new and different in a lot of ways, but they weren't in particular very challenging. As long as you'll just play it safe, a la Dark Souls, you really don't die too much to these guys, except for 1 or 2 situations where the game really did set up a beginner's trap. In particular, there's these bats that fly out of the caves that can easily knock you off of a ledge for an instant death if you're not holding the block button down. And of course, if you didn't know the bats were there, why would you be holding the block button? So I did accidentally die once or twice and or fell off a cliff a couple times, leading to some silly deaths during the course of this stage, but for the most part, I stayed my distance from enemies, tried to pull them out and lure them out one by one rather than aggroing a bunch of them at once, and within about an hour and a half, I'd gotten to the boss, which was this cool and unique Batwoman. Won't spoil too much about it, but she was a little bit tricky, took a couple chances to try to kill her, and then finally, after a couple deaths, I took her out on my 3rd try. And so, within about 5 hours of gameplay, I'd already beaten the first 2 stages, pretty much without a hitch, to which left me kind of scratching my head a little bit saying, this seems like it is a lot easier than that alpha that I played last year, where, I mean, that alpha, I had played it for about 3 to 4 hours and hadn't even completed it yet. Here I am playing 4 or 5 hours. I'd already beaten multiple major stages of the game, and it seemed like there might have been a little bit of a discrepancy. So then I went back and I checked out some of the sub-stories, which essentially are just the side missions of the game. It's grinding. It's basically going back to stages you've already completed, running through them a second time in maybe a different order, and killing different enemies who were in the place of the ones that were there originally when you played it as a story mission. Really nothing very interesting whatsoever in these missions. It basically is grinding in order to earn additional experience points to level your character up and or get some unique loot, which is kind of neat, but at the same time, I wish that there was more unique locations, and it was a little bit disappointing that in order to do this, I kind of had to just go through the same stages and kill a bunch of generic enemies rather than doing anything different or unique for a side mission. So after completing those, I now went on to stage 3, which was, you guessed it, the second half of the alpha that I played in 2016. This kind of courtyard that has a lot of swamp and or water, that has enemies inside of it. You have to knock trees over to create bridges while you're fighting these different monsters. Then there's eventually a giant courtyard leading to this kind of castle-like atmosphere. Once you're inside of there, you have a big epic boss fight against some kind of a creature that's electrified with a lightning capability. And honestly, I pretty much turboed through it. Yeah, I did die a few times when I came to some of the statue-like enemies that could kill you with 1 or 2 hits, but outside of that, I turboed through it way easier than when I had played the alpha last year, which makes me kind of wonder what happened here. There were some enemies here that literally were not present at all, but they were in the alpha. Other enemies that were really difficult to kill in the alpha ended up just kind of standing around while I mashed attack and just destroyed them, pretty quickly. So obviously, there's some kind of a difference in experience here from what I did last year and what I'm playing now in the final version of the game, and it kind of confuses me. So anyway, after that, I then ran into a new, completely different area of the game, an underground temple. This was pretty cool, where there were traps and stuff set up, and had to basically explore all these different side paths and areas in order to find a way to unlock the doors. After I unlocked the door, I had a final cool boss fight, and that ended stage 3. So, essentially for 8 hours of gameplay, I've done 3 main story missions, the intro, a bunch of the dojo missions. I've unlocked things like the ninjutsu and the magic abilities in my character, and I've done some of the generic kind of side questing. And overall, I have to say, my experience is a positive one, but I still have a big lingering question. Why is there such a big difference between the difficulty level of the alpha that I played last year and the final game? It seems to me like the game was made incredibly easy compared to how it was in the original version that was presented to everyone last year, at least in my experience. I certainly don't think that I've leveled up my gameplay ability so much in a simple year that I am now coasting through this game with little to no difficulty. I think that something is afoot here. And why would Tecmo and or Team Ninja have presented an alpha and multiple betas of this game that represented a difficulty level that was proportionately higher than that in the final retail game? It almost seems like a bait and switch. Like, look, it's going to be the hardest game ever. Go buy it. It's going to be like Dark Souls. And then when you buy it, you realize it's not like that at all. It's actually a lot easier. Now, let's be honest here. I've only played for 8 hours, and from all reports, this game, if you do all the side content, can be up to 60 hours in length, which is pretty damn crazy when you think about it in 2017. Most games don't even have a fraction of that amount of content. But is it all going to be like this, or is the difficulty all of a sudden going to have a sharp spike and ramp up at some point where I'm going to hit brick walls like I do in Dark Souls and have a bunch of difficulty progressing? Or is it going to continue on at this pace of just kind of, not too challenging, maybe get a few cheap deaths here and there, maybe when you see a new boss, die once or twice till you learn the pattern? Because if that's the case, the game's good, but it's certainly nowhere near as tough as the alpha that I played. And again, I have to ask, what is the deal? Why are they presenting us with an infinitely easier game now that it's out than what we saw last year? Now, the big controversy on the internet right now is that there are some people playing this game saying, no, it's really hard. It's so gruelingly difficult. It's tougher than Dark Souls. We're having a hard time getting through it to even do a game review for it. And I gotta kind of scratch my head and say, what are they talking about? Again, unless somewhere halfway through this game there's an insane difficulty spike, I'm just not seeing it. It seems to be really easy compared to the Dark Souls franchise and the game that I played in the alpha last year. Are there 2 different versions of Nioh out there? Is the digital version being sold over PlayStation Network and maybe over Xbox Live different from the game that was finally published on the physical discs? If there was, this could be one of the biggest catastrophes in gaming history, because that is completely unacceptable that a game publisher would put out 2 different versions of the game by accident, not disclose that, and then sell them for the same full price. I mean, holy shit, at the very least, they should issue a patch saying, oops, we screwed up. If you want to play it on the harder difficulty, here's a patch that allows you to do that. Or, oops, we screwed up. If you want to play it on the easier difficulty because we wanted that to be the intended game, here's a patch to change the game over to that. They haven't done that as of yet. So I'm actually going to ask you, the viewer, are you playing Nioh? Are you finding it incredibly difficult? What version of the game did you buy? Because how is it that I'm coasting through it like this, but other people seem to be saying it's the toughest game they've ever played? I am so confused. I don't know what's going on. And at this point, I think we need to do, as a community, some talking and some communication to figure out and get to the bottom of this situation. So, leave a comment, tweet me at They Call Me DSP, start talking about this publicly. Let's get a definitive answer. Is Nioh an easier game than they tried to advertise it as it was going to be? Was it dumbed down? Or are there accidentally two versions of the game out there? Because after 8 hours of gameplay, my impressions are this. I like the game. I like that it's got a more kind of Asian style with samurais and all kinds of that instead of the traditional kind of medieval style that Dark Souls has had. And I'll tell you this, the controls of Nioh are much better than Dark Souls because the game runs at 60 frames per second and you are able to react so much more easily to things. The second boss, the Batwoman, right, has this ability that paralyzes you, and I was literally dodging it at the very last second in this game, while in Dark Souls, I always had to try to dodge things way in advance. I was never able to really dodge things on the fly in reaction because that game has such an input delay. This game doesn't seem to have that at all if you're playing it on the 60 frames per second version, so if anything, I love that, and I think maybe that's why the game seems like it could be a lot easier than the Dark Souls games, but I don't know. I like the game. I'm going to continue playing it. Certainly, it seems like it's going to be a fun one with the amount of content that's in it. It just baffles me that it seems so much less difficult than that alpha that I played last year. So that is it for my initial impressions on Nioh, everyone. More than ever, I need your feedback. Again, leave a comment or tweet me. Let me know what you think. Let's try to get some public discussion about this game out there so we can get to the bottom of this issue when it comes to the difficulty difference of what people seem to be saying about this game. If you liked this video, please consider giving it a like here on YouTube. Please consider subscribing to KO Gaming for future videos like this. And if there ever is an actual kind of a determination on this game, I'll be doing a follow-up video about that as well. Of course, I'll also be reviewing Nioh in the near future. So if you want to know all that kind of information or my thoughts there, definitely subscribe to the channel. Please check out the description of this video for a link to my ongoing raw playthrough of Nioh, as well as some cool links such as a Loot Crate discount code and a link to my Patreon as well. Thanks a lot, everyone, for watching, and I'll see you next time right here on KO Gaming.